So here's my truck. It's nothing fancy. I wanted a camper shell on the back so that we could take the dogs around, but it was super hard to find. And eventually I found this beauty. It does need a new clear coat on the top. It was a little dirty, but that's fine with me. Eventually I'll tackle that stuff. I started by going up to the attic and moving some things around just to check where I would be able to hang a chain. I found a couple good ceiling joists right above where the truck could back in. I went up to the lumber rack and found a nice piece of 4x6 that I had used for another project. This would be plenty strong. Taking the measurement that I got up from the attic, I cut the 4x6 down to size. I had recently put some OSB sheeting up in the attic and I didn't want to move it all again, so all I had to do was notch out where the 4x6 had to go. I used a pencil to mark the drywall right above the center of the 4x6. Then I used a 1/2-inch drill bit and just kind of wobbled it around until I could fit a piece of chain through it. Just so it wouldn't move around, I attached the 4x6 to the joist with some screws. It's kind of dark up here so it's hard to see, but I just wrapped a big thick chain around the 4x6 and down through the hole in the drywall. I found a spot on the wall over here where I wanted to mount the winch, so I used a stud finder to locate those two studs. Over at the miter saw again, I just chopped up a couple pieces of scrap 2x4 to act as a base. I drilled a couple of pilot holes on each side of both boards. Now that I knew where the studs were, I just located that behind the screw and drove in the first screw. Then I used a level to make sure that it was perfectly level and then just sunk in the rest of the screws. I'm using just a simple hand winch that I found at Harbor Freight, so I put it up here, marked where the holes were, and then pre-drilled those holes before sinking in some big heavy lag screws. This is directly above the winch. I drilled a hole into the drywall and then a smaller pilot hole into the ceiling joist, and then I screwed in this heavy-duty eye bolt with a hook on it and then attached the pulley. This chain is the one that I hung on the 4x6 in the attic. I also added a pulley by putting a bolt with a nut to secure it. Now I just needed to finish setting up the hand winch. I attached the handle and then ran the cable through the side of the spool and then locked it in place with the little hardware that it came with. Now I just strung the cable from the winch up through both pulleys. I started cranking the handle to spool the cable in, but the gear reduction is so much that it takes forever. I realized that I could just chuck up my drill where the hand crank was and it went way faster. So now it was time to focus on the camper shell itself. So this is how the basic setup would go. I'd put a bolt with a washer and a metal plate that would go through the camper shell and then get attached on the top with this D-ring hook. I needed to figure out exactly where the balancing point of the camper shell was, so I came up with this idea. I used the bandsaw and cut off some of the scrap wood to make a very dull point. And I took it over to the sander and just kind of smoothed that all over. Also, the big metal plate is actually just a wheel from a pizza cutter, and so I wouldn't cut myself, I just dulled the blade with the sander. I used my car jack and the piece of scrap wood that I had just put a dull point on underneath the camper shell and just trial and error lifted it up a bunch of times until I found the exact balancing point. Now I knew where that point was, I marked it out with a silver Sharpie and then lowered the camper shell back down to the ground. I positioned the bit right in the center of the point that I had just found and drilled a hole all the way through to the top of the camper shell. From below, I inserted the bolt with the washer, metal plate, and a rubber washer that I found. I put a nice thick bead of silicone on the top and then attached the D-ring. I did have a little trouble keeping that bolt up, so I ended up having my wife help me keep it up while I could get the nut on. Now I just hooked it on and tested it out. Again, it was super slow, so I just used the drill. The cable did have some twisty tension in it, so the first time I took it up, it just kind of sat there and spun around for a while. The project was totally done, so now I could just use the winch, lift it up, and put it on the truck.